G'day viewers, thank you for joining us. Today we've got Ben Goertzel and he's going to address some of the objections to uploading that were outlined in an article recently on IO9 by George Dvorsky. They may not be George Dvorsky's objections, but he chose these objections as being perhaps the most popular, the most the most spoken about objections to the idea of uploading. And the article was entitled "You probably won't be able to upload your brain" or something like that. So the first one, the first question was, well, brain functions are not computable. This is to say the brain is not computable, but this is going a little bit further and saying that brain functions are not computable. What do you got to say about that?
Well, there's really no scientific evidence in favor of the contention that brain functions are not computable. Like there is no piece of data that tells you that. That's just an idea that some people have. I mean, in fact, there is no piece of evidence telling us that the universe as a whole is not computable. If you think about it, the totality of scientific data ever gathered is a finite collection of finite precision numbers, and any finite set of bits you could model using some computer program. So as far as science goes, the whole universe may be computable. Certainly the brain seems to be modelable that way. Is it possible in some sense the brain is not computable? Of course that's possible, because we never know anything for sure in science. But given that there's absolutely no evidence in favor of the contention the brain is uncomputable, I mean, why should we really consider that any more than we consider, well, our brains are controlled by some aliens on some other galaxy? I mean, it's just, the uncomputable brain is just a fanciful idea with no evidence behind it, and I think people like that idea because they feel like their own thought processes are somehow cosmic and mysterious and beyond comprehensibility, and a computer program is such a boring, routine thing. I couldn't really just be the same thing as Microsoft Word or Pac-Man, right? But of course, not all computer programs, not all computable systems are alike, and the human mind is much, much more complex than any computer or any software that we're operating with now. So current computer programs are not necessarily a good way to think about the mind. But that doesn't mean that in the abstract sense of computability theory, it doesn't mean you couldn't model the mind that way. So I think that's just total wishful thinking by people who want to believe the human mind is somehow cosmic and ineffable and beyond comprehension. But it's a theological rather than a scientific notion.
Sure. Well, it's interesting. People have different ideas about what level we might need to, if we wanted to actually, I guess, like simulate or emulate the brain function. At what level do we need to go to the level of the neurons, or just a population of neurons, or do we need to go down to like the atoms? Do we need to go down to the quark Planck scale, or whatever beyond that? What level do you think that we need
Well,
to
yeah, there's
simulate?
different questions here, right? One is, how closely would you have to emulate the human brain as a class of systems in order to create a human-like general intelligence? That's one question. Another question is, how closely would you have to emulate my specific brain in order to get me in the computer instead of some other human-like computing system in the computer? And I mean, we don't know the answer to that very solidly. All the evidence points to the fact that what we need is the connectome, neurons, synapses, and neurotransmitters, and not the microtubules and quarks and partons and all this other lower level physics stuff. I mean, again, there are people speculating that maybe you need to go down really, really far and get the quantum non-locality in the microtubules in the cell walls of the neurons, and You can't rule that out, again, because in science you never know anything for sure. You can't rule anything out. But there is no evidence in favor of that. I mean, even if there's some level of quantum dynamics going on in the brain in some meaningful way, which is not really demonstrated either at this point, although there are some inklings in that direction, that still doesn't show that you would need that in order to emulate the relevant functions of a brain in a computer. So I mean, if we're going by science as we know it today, then looks like the connectome and some chemicals is what we need. And this is going to be something to be explored via experiment. I mean, we can build closer and closer approximations to the brain of a person or an animal and see what they behave like, see what they say they feel like. These should be interesting experiments to do. I look forward to communicating with an array of approximate bends. One that has my neurons and synapses, one that has my molecules, one that has my quarks, right? And can you really tell the difference between these guys? I personally bet you won't be able to. My scientific intuition is that you don't need to really go that deep, but that's not an in principle objection to mind uploading, of course, because using future brain scanning technologies, we may well be able to drill down to a quite deep level of detail in scanning a brain.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. All right. Well, there is another question here. Where there's like eight objections. Let's see if we can get through them all. The second objection is we'll never solve the hard problem of consciousness. Now, first of all, what is the hard problems of consciousness, and do you think it exists, and is it hard? And what is
Well,
consciousness while you're at it?
yeah. So the hard problem of consciousness was defined by philosopher David Chalmers as basically being connecting the physical correlates of consciousness with the subjective feeling of consciousness, the qualia, as they call it. And this gap between the subjective and the objective is what Chalmers called the hard problem of consciousness. And personally, I think it's kind of an ill-posed problem because I'm a panpsychist, and I think that everything in the universe has some little element of consciousness. So basically, there is no gap. If everything is a little bit conscious in some sense, then
The problem
there's no
goes
problem.
away.
Yeah, the problem goes away, and I mean that is the oldest solution. I mean, if you read Aldous Huxley, The Perennial Philosophy, almost all of the world's religions have some mystical core which holds this basic idea. The world is the mind of God. Everything is conscious somehow. And if you don't believe that, you have some philosophy problems to solve. You basically fall back in some kind of Cartesian dualism where there's this mind domain and this world domain, and then how do they connect with each other? And that's a hard philosophy problem, but the way I think about it is we live our lives every day in defiance of our incomprehension of the philosophical basis of the world, right? I mean, how do I know that my wife or my kids are conscious beings as opposed to just being automata that I put into my life to annoy and entertain me? I mean, I can never truly know that. I can assume that because it makes my life simpler and more pleasant to assume they have consciousness. I would start to feel bad and kind of weird, even weirder than I normally do, if I really thought everyone around me was just some automaton with no awareness and I was the only conscious being. I would feel a bit lonely. So I find it more convenient to assume all you people have some consciousness. I don't really know that. I don't sit around all day wondering, like, how can I prove to myself these people are conscious? I mean, you just bypass that. Time is another issue. The philosophy of time is unresolved. What is time? None of us knows what time is. How do we build this linear axis of time from the past to the present to the future out of each individual moment, some of which are quite temporally disoriented? I mean, the philosophy of time is just as confused as the philosophy of consciousness when you start to read philosophy papers and books. Nevertheless, we build systems that operate in time without really worrying about whether we've solved all the hard problems of temporal philosophy. So, I mean, I think philosophy is interesting. It's worthwhile. Thinking about it helps us understand ourselves and our lives better. It guides science and engineering. And on the other hand, philosophy problems are not meant to be solved. Philosophy goes from one question to other questions. And in the meantime, while people are screwing their minds into knots over philosophy questions, we build machines that operate in time even though we don't understand time. We make beautiful artworks even though the philosophy of beauty is unresolved. And I'm quite sure we can build conscious machines even though the philosophy of consciousness may never be solved.
Well, there might be a lot of philosophical questions which will never be solved. That's true. So, well, here's an interesting thing that Anders Sandberg suggests, in that philosophers can be very useful in helping design scientific experiments along with the scientists, especially if they've got some scientific background. And he said that with with a neuroscience hat on. I think he used to study computational neuroscience or something like that. But he thinks that sometimes scientists get into a trap of not being able to conduct or
Well,
create
I think
interesting experiments. But philosophers can help create the interesting experiments along with
I
the
think
scientists.
I think perhaps Anders Sandberg can help create interesting experiments because Anders knows an awful lot of science compared to your average philosopher, right? And I think
Yes.
that's an interesting ideal, which not many actual philosophers now are prepared to realize, but I would like to see that happen more so. Of course, 150 years ago, science was called natural philosophy, and
Hmm.
there wasn't such a big distinction between the two. Science at that point was driven primarily by the desire to understand the world, and in the middle of the last century, we had to move to a more industrial kind of science, where science is thought of more as the handmaiden of engineering. You do science to figure out how to build stuff rather than to understand the world. And I would be happy to see more science move back in the direction of natural philosophy, where the motivation is understanding. And I actually think that's where the biggest engineering breakthroughs are likely to come, not when you're doing science to figure out how to improve this machine or this engineering process. You're doing science to try to resolve something you're totally confused about or try to learn something totally new, and then some engineering breakthrough may emerge from that indirectly. Certainly in my own AI work, I was originally driven by wanting to understand the mind, more so than by wanting to build stuff. And then over time, my interest gradually morphed from just wanting to understand how my own mind worked and how mind in general works to, okay, well, first of all, the best way to prove you've understood it is to build it. And secondly, I mean, given some understanding of how the human mind works, you still don't know how mind in general works. And you want to explore the space of minds more broadly by building various different minds. But I think that the urge to understand things at a fundamental level is an important driver. Sure, and I mean that's one of the drivers of mind uploading as well. I mean, not just experimenting with engineering, but experimenting with inner experience. What new inner vistas will we uncover by porting our consciousness and our intelligence into all sorts of different physical substrates? Like, what is it like to have your brain inside a bird? What would it be like to have my brain inside a woman, or inside a flying
It
octopus?
was at one stage.
Yeah, perhaps so. But my mind at that point was pretty stupid, so it didn't appreciate the experience enough, and
Well,
it
if you
wouldn't.
find the right woman.
There's a South Park episode about that. It didn't turn out well. Yeah.
Well, maybe the philosophers one day will have the penny drop and they'll be able to define what the raw field really is. And then they'll say, "Hey, but you can't compute that." But then suddenly you'll get that raw feel, you'll simulate it, and then put it into a computational simulation and give it back to them for their birthday, and they can experience it over and over again.
Yeah, sure, sure.
But what will that raw feel be? I'll leave that to people's imagination. So the next question is, we'll never solve the binding problem. So, never. What is the binding problem?
Oh, the binding problem is a problem of cognitive neuroscience, wherein the different traces in the brain representing some observed object are distributed all throughout the brain. So like when I look at my hand here in front of me, there's not like a hand neuron that lights up. Rather, processes all over the place become active, representing different aspects of the event of observing a hand. How do all these get bound together within the brain when they're so distant? I mean, the essence of a solution to that already exists. If you look at the work of Eugene Izhikevich and Gerald Edelman doing large-scale brain simulations a few years back. I mean, you have evidence for nonlinear waves kind of synchronizing together just distant parts of the brain in collective, chaotic and more complex forms of dynamics. I mean, this is a problem that is well within the scope of nonlinear dynamics to solve. We haven't solved it in detail yet, only because we don't have sufficiently detailed neuroimaging data to know exactly what dynamical system the brain is. But I mean, there have been computer simulations of large chunks of brain that have binding going on in them between disparate regions using nonlinear dynamics. So I don't see any strong reason to think you couldn't solve the binding problem. It's not a cosmic conundrum like the hard problem of consciousness. It's just a science problem. I mean, you could take any science problem and say maybe we'll never solve it, right? I mean, it's you could say we'll never go to the stars because we'll never solve the propulsion problem. And ultimately, if someone wants to say that, you can't prove them wrong. You just have to do it.
Hmm. Definitely. So, well, now people, there's a like, what is the unity of phenomenal consciousness? How would you describe that?
Well, by its very nature, the unity of phenomenal consciousness cannot be described. So it must be a trick question, right? I mean, that's it. If all is one, then the moment you describe it with a word, you distinguish it from something else. So you've got the answer wrong. I
Hmm.
think, however, the neural correlate of the experience of unity of consciousness probably is some strange attractor which binds together the whole brain or most of the brain. I mean, the experience of unity is probably tied in with a dynamical unity of interaction of different neurons in the brain. And the time scale of our conscious experience is maybe half a second or a quarter second. If you have some strange attractor dynamics going on much faster than that inside the brain, that's binding all the neurons in disparate regions together into a practical unity in the same attractor. And one imagines that is part of the neural correlate of the feeling of the unity of consciousness.
Mm. So it's not our feeling of the unity of consciousness is not necessarily any unity at all. It's just an
Well,
illusion.
I think it is not necessarily a unity in the physical world, but I wouldn't deny the subjective experience its own reality. And that gets you back to the hard problem of consciousness. So, like, how do you tie together these things we experience and that we can communicate in language with each other with apparent mutual understanding? How do you tie that together with the physical dynamics? And I mean, a term often used in the consciousness literature now is neural correlates of
Yeah.
consciousness, cognitive correlates of consciousness.
Hmm.
You can find those, but that's still not exactly giving you a scientific or even experimental psychology explanation of the feeling. It's just linking these other things to subjective feelings.
Mm.
And maybe that's all we can do, or maybe some future discipline binding science and philosophy in a way that current disciplines do not. Maybe some future discipline will solve that problem in a new way that we don't understand yet. I
Mm.
don't know. But, I mean, in terms of Dvorsky's objections to mind uploading, I I really don't think this sort of philosophical worry should cause us to doubt the scientific and engineering possibility of porting the memories, the knowledge, the perceptions, the emotions that are in me into some arrangement of things in a different substrate.
Okay. Well, the next one was, and you touched on this before, is the idea of panpsychism. Now, if panpsychism is true, it's being posed as an objection to uploading or simulating the brain. Now, why would it be posed as an objection?
I have no idea, and Dvorsky didn't really explain that in his article. It doesn't. I don't see why that would be an objection in itself. I think the hypothesis that would be an objection to mind uploading is that the particular consciousness of humans is really in the particular flavor of consciousness in neurons specifically, or glia specifically, as biological entities. So that if you know those biological entities in some system, it's not going to have the specific neuron or glia flavor of consciousness, and therefore it's not going to have human-like consciousness. And then maybe the switches inside a silicon chip have a much weaker form of consciousness than neurons do. And then you can never get something with human-like consciousness by putting together switches rather than neurons. I mean, that's hand-waving speculation to try to find an objection, though. I mean, again,
Well, they
there's
may not have
no.
been George's objections, but these may have, for some reason, come up as objections before. Have you seen an argument for panpsychism being an objection to the idea that the mind isn't a computer, or the mind cannot be computed, or if
No,
it's
not really. I mean, the
special?
thing is, it doesn't make sense to me. If everything is conscious, then why can't the molecules inside the computer be conscious, just like the ones inside the brain? I mean, I think that panpsychism often happens to come along with a sort of nature-oriented spiritual view of the mind. So a lot of the same people who
Not,
say,
not
well,
animism.
a lot of the same people who say, well, mind and life come together, and you can't differentiate consciousness from living, breathing, warm, sticky flesh. A lot of the same people who say that also believe in panpsychism. But I think the idea that only things that are biologically living have consciousness, yeah, that would be a kind of animism, which is different than panpsychism. And I mean, Dvorsky didn't get into that level of detail in his article.
Okay. So, well, what about Hameroff and Penrose's idea of the microtubule sort of quantum sort of decoherence or whatever it is? Do you believe that there's any merit in that?
No, I think there is no scientific evidence for that at this time. I mean, it's a valid hypothesis, as many things are. But I almost see that theory, though, as a kind of proxy for other theories that might be correct. Like, I think it's possible that there could be some role for quantum mechanics in the human brain. And there may be some quantum non-locality going on in the human brain. I personally doubt that this business with microtubules is really how it happens. I mean, even if there is some quantum stuff going on in the brain, I bet the microtubules are not not the way that it works. And the other question, though, is if there are quantum dynamics happening in the brain, then that doesn't necessarily imply that the brain is doing something so super smart you couldn't simulate it in a digital computer. And it certainly doesn't imply that you couldn't simulate the brain in a quantum computer. So, one point to clarify is Hameroff and Penrose are going really, really far out, right? Because one thing you could hypothesize is that the brain is a quantum computer. And then you have theorems by David Deutsch and others saying that a quantum computer can only compute the same functions that a digital computer can, but sometimes on average it can compute them faster. And then you have the question of, okay, if the brain is a quantum computer, how good of one is it? Like, how much does it really exploit the power of quantum computing to do stuff faster? Now, Hameroff and Penrose want to go a step further and say, no, the brain is not a boring old quantum computer. The brain is a quantum gravity computer. And once we have a theory of quantum gravity, which we do not have at the present time, then it will be an uncomputable theory. And therefore the brain is uncomputable, and therefore uploading into a computational substrate will be impossible. But that's really piling speculations on top of speculations, right? I mean, first of all, we'd have to get a quantum gravity theory, which is uncomputable. No existing physics theory is, so that would be weird. And it wouldn't be clear how you would validate that based on observations which are finite precision numbers either. So you would need not only a new theory of quantum gravity, which posited uncomputable reality, but you would need a whole new kind of science going beyond any science we've ever seen in some foundational way. Then you would need the brain to rely on this weird new kind of science when it's not even demonstrated the brain is a quantum computer, which would be a much simpler thing. So I think you're really going out on a limb that is growing off a limb that is growing off a limb there. And I mean, it's possible, but why would you want to use that speculation as an objection to doing something practical? That's only if you're just fishing for some reason to say minds couldn't be uploaded or AI couldn't be put into a computer. I mean, that kind of theory is not something that comes out of observed evidence. That's a theory that comes out of, well, I really don't want the mind to be explicable in terms of computation. Is there any way I could scientifically justify not being computable? Well, here's a far-fetched theory that could possibly explain that.
Yeah, it's
So
interesting.
I don't think we need to take that too seriously.
Yeah, me too. But like I think it's interesting that we've actually seen some sort of quantum warp going on in some photosynthesis function in plants. I wouldn't be surprised if there was like some like no, quantum noise affecting most biology to some degree. Whether the brain has
Well,
evolved to make use of it, I don't know. But
there's an
if the
interesting.
brain did evolve to make use of quantum noise or other quantum sort of style events, then wouldn't we know? Would we be able to tell the difference between a brain which did and that which didn't? Would we be able to compare the brain of a zombie and the brain of a human and actually
Well,
see anatomical differences?
I mean, whether the brain uses quantum dynamics and whether these quantum dynamics have anything to do with consciousness are quite different questions. I mean, in many cases, a quantum dynamic may just be a different way to solve a certain practical problem. I mean, if you look at the way quantum non-locality is used in birds, I mean, birds use it to sense the direction of the Earth's magnetic field. So that they use some protein molecules that are in quantum non-local superposed states. Now, that's really interesting. On the other hand, airplanes also detect the direction of the Earth's magnetic field without using quantum non-locality. So in that case, the quantum aspect doesn't give you any magic, right? I mean, it does something, and there are other ways to do it without quantum dynamics, which are actually better. So whether the brain uses quantum stuff is one question. Whether it gets a big computational boost over digital computers that way is another question. Whether that has anything to do with the unique characteristics of our conscious experience is a different question. And there's really no evidence for any of these things at this point in time. So again, I mean, you could always come up with some possible objection to anything. And if you're driven by a desire to make a certain conclusion, you can come up with many far-fetched stories that would make that conclusion possible. I would say the possibility of mind uploading is a fairly direct extrapolation from evidence, whereas the objections to mind uploading are grasping at straws in order to find some barely plausible and rational line of argument that would prove mind uploading is impossible.
All right, cool. So, yeah, it's hard to know how quantum, or thermal noise will affect the brain. But I mean, like, it'd be interesting. I'd like to see the studies that actually prove that's happening. For now, it seems as though it's just in the ballpark of philosophers until we can start testing it. But moving on to the next question, which is kind of relating to an earlier question, I think. Mind-body dualism. Is the mind separate from the body, or is it just an interesting way of thinking about the mind?
More and more philosophy. I mean, if you look at the work of the philosopher Galen Strawson, he's made a pretty good argument that the whole idea of dualism is just logic. Like, no one has ever formulated a logically consistent version of the theory that the mind and the physical world are totally different things. I mean, you just can do an infinite regress of problems. Like, okay, let's say the mind is one thing, the physical world is another. How do they communicate with each other, right? I mean, okay, you could say the mind has some interface that translates mind stuff into physical world stuff, but how does that interface work?
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
you just get homunculi within homunculi within homunculi in an infinite regress or something, and it's not even clear you can make a sensible and consistent model of the mind and world that way. And I mean, quantum mechanics certainly doesn't push in that direction either, with its whole intertwining of the observer and the observed and the quantum measurement issues and so forth. Those push much more toward the act of observation as being part and parcel of what's happening in the physical world. So again, an objection without any evidence, motivated solely by wishful thinking.
Yeah, well, sometimes my homuncular gets bored and wants to go on vacation. So I might try and outsource my homunculi to Ethiopia. Do you think I'd be able to get a good price?
Well, yeah, but you might get some interesting, I don't know, it's not called voodoo there, but you might
That's all
get
right.
some interesting juju in your homunculus, you know? So
That's cool, man. I don't mind a bit of juju. It gives me mojo. Juju and mojo, they
perhaps.
sound pretty similar, so.
Well, there's the hard problem of juju and mojo. I mean, how can you really bridge them? Right?
Well, I think somebody should start doing some experiments on that. All right, so the next point, the next objection is number 6. Would it be ethical to develop? That's an objection. Think of that in terms of an injection. The question is, would it be
Well, the
ethical to
objection
inject?
would be, it is possible. I would give it at least a 0.000000001% chance that the human race will decide it's unethical and therefore not do it. I mean, really, how often has it happened in human history that oh, there's this really awesome technology that some people with a lot of resources would really love to have, but we're not sure it's ethical, so let's not build it. I mean, that's not how humanity tends to operate. So even if I agreed it was unethical, I would still not consider that as a reason why it's not going to happen. I mean, the human race is pretty good at doing things that are cool and give us new capabilities, but are ethically debatable, right? Having said that, I also don't see why you would say that it is unethical. I mean, the best argument I saw for that was by Thomas Metzinger, the German philosopher, in somewhere in his book Being No One, which is about consciousness and the brain. He says it will be unethical to create AIs because the early stage AIs might suffer a lot while we were debugging them and didn't yet understand how to make their experience okay. And you could make that as an objection to mind uploading. Like, what if it really sucks being an upload? Do you really have the right to inflict that on the first test subjects, even if they agree to it? But in the end, I mean, I think we have a moral imperative to make life better, to eliminate suffering, and to expand our experience and our capabilities. So to my mind, it is immoral to let people get old and die without giving them the option of moving their mind into a different and more permanent substrate. I mean, this gets into the ethical question of, the ethics of killing someone versus letting them die. Because we're letting everyone die now when they get old. And why is that ethical? Why is it ethical to let all these people die when it seems plausible now that science can stop that from happening? So how is it ethical to spend so much of our money on Louis Vuitton luggage and idiotic television shows and everything
And they
else that
call
we
it
spend
idiot
our money
box.
on? I mean, why is it ethical for us to spend all our money on that instead of spending our money on research and development to abolish the plight of involuntary death? To me, that's what's immoral. So letting everyone get old and die instead of letting them upload or creating an AGI that will make a longevity pill or doing something else to stop all the death and all the suffering. I can't understand why Dvorsky or anyone else thinks it's ethical to let everyone get old or sick and die. To me, that is barbarous, and I think in the future our descendants will look back and be amazed that we managed to accept death as a routine fact of life. I mean, right now, today, living in modern society, when I read about some of the initiation rites of Native Americans, you would take someone 12 years old and first of all you circumcise them at age 12, which sounds unpleasant. Then for a couple of days you weave some leather through their chest and suspend them from a tree by that leather for a couple of days to let them prove their manhood. We think that is barbarous and demented. None of us would want to do it, but to them that was just life. That's what you do to become a man. And I think that's how we're going to look back on a lot of things from today, among them being death. Like, it's going to seem incredibly barbaric that we just sat there and let Grandpa die and then be dead and not be with us and not be conscious anymore. That's going to seem bizarre. And the idea that it would be more moral to let him get old, lose his mind, get aches and pains for 20 years, become blind and deaf and unable to walk, and then finally have a heart attack and die. The idea that somehow that is more ethical than moving his mind into a young new body, that's going to seem just incredibly bizarre. It already seems bizarre to me.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate. Yeah, one of my friends from Melbourne, who I briefly introduced to the Singularity like about a year and a half ago, and who attended the last Humanity Plus summit, or he might have come to the Singularity summit, just died all of a sudden. It's kind of
Mm.
crazy. It's freaking me out. And he was young. He was like 28 years old. It's
Well,
crazy.
my nephew died all of a sudden of just a freak meningitis infection that he caught from sharing a soda or something. He showed no symptoms until the middle of one night. He started seizuring in his sleep. Then he died a few hours later. He's 14 years old.
Yeah.
I mean, if he had a backup copy, you just install the backup in a new body, he would have lost the last few hours of memories or something, right? I mean, the idea of living with no backup copy is going to seem massively absurd in the future. It's going to seem ridiculous.
Mm. Yeah. It's kind of like it seems so abstract and like so far from the reality we're living in now. But yeah, I agree. These things will become scientifically possible if we work on them, and that's the thing. We're not going to just suddenly fall into this sort of wonderful utopia future if we don't work on these problems, right?
Yeah, fortunately, some people are working on them now, but not nearly as hard as we could be. Of course, if you compare the amount of resources put into life extension, mind uploading, or AGI, compared to the amount put into, say, making killing machines or developing algorithms to do high frequency trading to still get more money than other people by going in and out of each or making more attractive more impressive looking suits. I mean, the amount of resources that our society fritters away on silly and unnecessary things is going to seem quite insane in the future.
Mm.
Given the situation we're in, where a relatively modest expenditure of resources could allow us to break out of this rather unsatisfactory legacy mode of embodied existence and move into much more flexible realms of being.
Yeah, definitely. Well, all right. Well, let's move on to the next one. And that is number seven, lucky seven. We can never be sure that it works. So, well, can we ever
That's
be
all.
actually sure?
That's all right. You know, I woke up this morning and I wasn't sure I was the same guy as when I went to sleep last night. And
How do you,
you
how do you
know,
know?
I'm really hard to believe I'm the same guy I was when I was like 3 years old. My worldview was pretty different then. So how do you know it worked? Of course, you'd never know for sure it worked, but that's a philosophical problem we probably are not going to solve. I mean, maybe we will solve it in some way I can't foresee now, using some new discipline that goes beyond the definition of science as we now know it, right? But I don't think a solution to that is immediately in supply. But I think that if you saw 20 of your friends get uploaded into robot bodies, and these robot bodies then walked around and interacted with other people in a way that made it seem like they were your friends, and your friend Bob uploaded, and then the robot Bob says, "Yeah, I'm still Bob, of course," and he knows everything the real Bob said, and he reacts just like the real Bob, and so forth. I mean, eventually, once enough of your friends have done it, and you get jealous of them flying around in the sky, getting the internet in their brain, and never getting sick or dying, eventually you're going to believe them that they are, in fact, still themselves in this new infrastructure, and you will join them. Now, is there a very remote possibility that by uploading, consciousness is killing itself and replacing itself with its imitation? I mean, that's not impossible, and it's kind of ironic and amusing to think about. But again, there's just no evidence for something like that. So that's
Well, it's like saying like having a beer will change you. You might never be the same again.
it's a theological possibility. I mean, can you get your upload drunk? I guess. Right? I think an upload will have much more interesting ways to alter its mind state than that, though. I mean, the current drugs are very, very crude instruments,
Hmm.
and it's got to be possible to make drugs or other kinds of brain modification mechanisms that just work massively better without all the side effects and with a more precisely calculated impact. I mean, there's not yet been a drug designed from the standpoint, here is the mental experience I'd like to have. How do I design a drug that will cause that mental experience? Instead, it's all been trial and error. And
But
uploads will let
in
us,
upload state, you'll be able to actually go back to the original state that you were in before you took the drug.
you could
If
roll
you
back.
take the wrong acid,
Yeah,
if you take the wrong acid, then you never know who you're going to be afterwards, right?
yeah, it's a question of do you give your wife or your mother super user access to roll you back if you really get fucked up?
Yeah, that's right. All right, man.
That that will be the marriage vow of 2050, where
Hmm.
when you get
Super
married,
user.
you give your partner the root password to your brain computer, right?
That could get dangerous, you know. You'd have to
Yeah,
put some
yeah,
semaphores in.
that's right.
Yeah, but I mean, it might. You maybe have to have some sort of AI adjudicator. Uh, I
It's all right. The NSA will have the root password anyway. So
Yeah, yeah. Well, actually, the root password will be our like the hash code when we were born. The only people to know that will be ourselves and the government, or the AI overlord, the overseer, the collective.
yeah, exactly. And the aliens watching us from space.
Oh yes, yeah, they'll know. Yeah, and our simulators. So, objection 8. This is
Overruled.
overruled. Objection 8. Actually, let's turn it. Let's. This is a objection infinity on its side. Uploaded minds would be vulnerable to hacking and abuse. So, do you think that's going to be a
Well,
valid thing in the future?
for the possibility of hacking and abuse to be an objection to mind uploading, it would have to be the case that they're so vulnerable to hacking and abuse that the upload just won't be able to function, right? And I mean that's just a complete out there speculation. Like how can you how could you possibly know that? It seems unlikely. I mean, it seems like an upload is going to be a program like any other one. Might end up running on different hardware than we have now, but I mean, we do know how to protect programs from hacking pretty well. I mean, if you run a Linux system and you take good care not to leave vulnerabilities, it's hard to hack into you. And I think if you had people's minds on that Linux server, you would try even harder not to be hackable.
You could put everybody in the chroot jail. They'll never have access to the kernel.
Yeah,
Any
for
access.
example. I mean, I don't see why that should be so much harder than securing any other kind of software. And I don't see that the human body is that reliable either. I mean, we can't make backup copies, and we're prone to getting flattened by cars and getting heart attacks and so forth. So I mean, the human body has a different set of issues. The idea that those issues are so bad that they would make mind uploading a non-starter really seems inaccurate to me.
Yeah, definitely. Do you think we'll need our own personal firewalls, or do you think like yeah?
Absolutely, we will, and I mean, you can buy them now, right? So,
Well, how do I firewall my thinking like today? How do I firewall my head? We've got our skulls, but how do I firewall my brain against like crazy ideas?
I don't know. I never tried to do that. I just let the crazy ideas flourish. So, yeah, I haven't tried to solve that problem yet, but I try to let a crazy idea and a sane idea meet and annihilate, and then emit a photon of pure light, and that's how I became enlightened.
Well done.
Oh, I mean, it's just not an objection to mind uploading.
Absolutely.
Of course, there will be security risks, and some people may worry about so much they choose not to upload. But I mean, cloud computing had the same objection. How will we know it's secure? And of course, you don't know absolutely that the data on the Amazon EC2 cloud is secure.
Hmm.
But in practice, it's proved as secure or more than stuff kept on servers in someone's physical office. And it works. There's a constant struggle between people trying to steal things and mess with people, and then people trying to protect their things and keep themselves out of trouble. And doubtless that dynamic will get more and more complex once we have uploaded.
I guess the incentives for people to act will be different, like in an uploaded world. I mean, like, because everything's virtual, it's not like there's, assuming we get massive computation to sort of back it up, there's, compared to today, there won't be as much scarcity. So, yeah, I mean, it's hard to predict the sort of incentive structures people will have. But I'm hoping that we'll be able to move away from like a society where people incentivize to fuck other people over. Hello?
Yep.
Going to sleep in the middle of an interview. Did I put you to
No,
sleep?
I was uploading my mind.
Into your dream state. Yeah, it's
No,
late here too.
into the alien spaceship that's orbiting over Hong Kong, actually. So I'm about 90% done now, but
Uh, that last
for-
5%.
fortunately, it's a non-destructive upload, though. I think I'm still left down here. So,
Okay. Now, hopefully your torrent has been fully seeded. Otherwise, you won't ever make it all the way up.
yeah, and it's been hacked with all sorts of malware as well. So there'll be infectious Ben viruses beamed throughout the galactic internet. Huh?
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, in short, if you look at Dvorsky's objections to mind uploading, I mean, most of them seem like padding to me, ultimately. I mean, security and hacking isn't a real objection. Ethics isn't an objection to it being done, since the human race is not very ethical, even by its own standards. I think the binding problem is a science problem. That's not really a problem. I think the crux of the problem of mind uploading really comes down to the problem of consciousness and identity, and that's really what worries people about it. Once you peel away everything else, it's like, would that upload really be me? How would I know that it's me? How would I know it's not just an automaton that acts like me, that acts like it's conscious? And that is the crux of the mind uploading issue that disturbs people. Now, the XTRP email list, which is like the granddaddy of all email discussion lists of the future, they banned the discussion at that point after like many years of beating it into the ground because they saw, dozens of people have flogged this dead horse on the email list. All the arguments have gone back and forth forever. There's
Yeah.
nothing good to say about that problem. And
It started again, I can tell you.
yeah, and I mean, I don't have anything new to say about that problem either. I think that it's a philosophy problem that is beyond current science to solve. Some future discipline may be able to solve it by bringing together experiment and collective introspection. But the best path we have to solve that may be actually to do weird stuff with our brains and with uploads. I mean, if we could tap our brains together and share experience, I mean, that would go a long way toward addressing these sorts of things. And
I
then
agree. Yeah,
And
yeah.
then you're down to the familiar mind uploading experiments. Like, what if I upload one neuron at a time, and it still feels like me the whole time, and the guy I uploaded into said it felt like him the whole time? I mean, scientifically, these experiments won't resolve the problem. Experientially, I mean, having the experiential feeling of uploading gradually, or of linking my neurons in with yours, the combination of these introspective experiential experiments with the scientific empirical experiments may lead us to a new kind of science, or a kind of trans science that combines empirical data gathering with collective shared experience by wiring brains together. I mean, who knows? But anyway, I think solving that core problem of the philosophy of mind uploading, like solving the core problem of consciousness, the hard problem of consciousness, that's beyond science. as we know it now, and tools like AGIs and mind uploads are going to be the mechanisms by which we craft a new discipline of inquiry that allows us to actually solve these problems in ways that we can't now.
Yeah. Well, I hope so, because I want to be there when it happens. Yeah.
Well, there will be an Adam Ford there, and he will tell us he's you.
Mm.
So I'll be inclined to believe him because it's simpler.
Yeah, fair enough. But I mean, at the moment, we can't. We do actually connect to a degree through the medium of language, but it's such low bandwidth and low fidelity that it's not scientific for me to really understand what you think by just listening to you talk. However, I'm willing to go on faith that I understand what you're talking about, right? But do you think we'll ever be able to, if I could bottle or somehow intercept your thought processes, bottle them up and inject them into my brain, would I fully understand what you were thinking about? If it all is
No, because my thoughts are
interpreted by a different pattern.
holistic, right? I mean, the what I mean when I think of a certain equation or image is not the same thing it would mean to you. So
No, that's right.
in the end, you might need to import my whole brain into your brain, and
Well,
then I
that's
become
right.
your little homunculus. But I think there's plenty of opportunity to network together minds into a kind of mind meld where you would then absorb in your own way the crux of the other person's way of thinking about something.
Hmm. So it would be interesting if I could like approximate at least at first, and then somehow like grab the pattern of Ben's mind, which includes all the patterns of his thoughts about, and then put that in my head. So yeah, well that's been a really interesting discussion there. I think is there anything else that you wanted to point out about these particular points now
I, I,
before
I,
we go?
I don't think so. I mean, I look forward to laughing about this with the uploaded George Dvorsky in 50 years or so.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I wonder if he actually agrees with any of these particular objections. I'm not sure. I think he's really good at getting eyes onto the articles. He's a great writer, and he's writing for a pretty prestigious magazine. And he has sort of written a lot of techno-progressive sort of in favor of, the future experiments and all those sorts of things. So I'd be surprised if they were actually his objections. Yeah. So.
Um, I I don't know. I have a feeling George is in the camp that think there's something special about life and living systems that physical computers don't have. But I mean, speculating about someone else's underlying worldview is fraught with peril. So we better not go too deeply there.
There be dragons. Yeah.
Perhaps George will, perhaps George will be my counter argument, and we'll see what he thinks there.
All
So
right.
yeah, I'd better go before I fall asleep again. But
Yeah, no.
thanks for persisting till 1 a.m. Australia time. Anyhow,
Yeah, that's cool. Well, I look forward to seeing you if I can make it to either the GF 2045, which is on June the 15th and 16th, if I remember correctly, and the Humanity Plus in Hong Kong.
no, in Beijing.
Beijing. Beijing. That's right. I've already, I'm going back in time now. In Beijing. Thanks for reminding me.
All right. Yeah. Well, thanks for doing the interview, and I will talk to you later.
Yeah, I'll have this up probably later tonight. So yeah, speak soon. Thanks, Ben.
Cool. Good night.